Привет, привет. Что-то вы какие-то невеселые все. А кто, поднимите руку, кто впервые пришел на Kotlin Meetup. Класс. А, вот сколько у нас тут мобильных разработчиков? Все остальные это бэкэнд, да, я так понимаю, сегодня? Две руки. Хорошо. В общем, меня зовут Леонид, и мы на Kotlin Meetup. Сегодня неожиданно мы не в компании JetBrains его проводим, а в замечательной компании DataArt. И сегодня нам очень сильно повезло, потому что у нас в гостях Хади. Hey. Я передам ему слово. So, yep, the mic is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm totally and utterly embarrassed that I've been working at JetBrains for now nearly 10 years, and I've been married to my wife for now 18 years, and we've been together for 20 years, and she's Russian, and I still don't speak a lot of Russian. So my apologies. We have a new guy joining just recently, and he's like, I'm going to teach you Russian. I'm like, good luck. Good luck. Anyway, I'm going to give a talk around Ktor. How many of you here are Android developers? Backend developers? Spring? Ktor? Okay, so here's the great thing. I'm not an expert on Ktor. I know a little bit about it, but the best part is that the two guys that wrote it are in the room. There. Raise your hands. Come on. There you go. Come on. There you go. So, and here's the bonus. They're Russian. So, if you have any questions, just ask them in Russian. I don't need to know about it. Just directly have a debate. I know that it's always like, you know, it's funny and it's true that a lot of people at JetBrains are Russian or speak Russian. And every time I go to a meeting, they have to speak in English. And they all say to me they're very grateful because the meetings become so much shorter and less passionate, less emotional. So I'm like, it's good, right? So I want you to be emotional and speak to them in Russian. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you about Ktor. How many of you have heard of Ktor? Okay, great. It's an asynchronous framework for connected systems, which sounds fantastic. If you like Ktor and you want to try and sell this to your company and you're not successful, what you can do is asynchronous framework for connected system for distributed microservices backed with blockchain. Okay? So sell it like that. They'll buy into it. It doesn't matter what it does, they'll buy into it. So what is Ktor? It's a server, it's a client, it's multi-platform, and it's Kotlin through and through. It is asynchronous by nature. It is also open source, which translated means free, because we all care about the free aspect of open source, not about the contributing back part, so let them do it. It's built and maintained by us, primarily Sergey and Lona over there, and external contributors. It's on GitHub. It's inspired by some other frameworks such as Wasabi and Kara. Wasabi is something that I started, and then they just did so much better. So basically what they did is they killed my project, okay? I put 2 years of effort in, and they're like, Hadi, here, we're going to just do it better. Screw you. And also Kara. Anybody use Kara? So this is actually a very interesting story because Kara is, anybody heard of Ruby on Rails, right? Or ASP.NET MVC, right? So Kara was a Ruby on Rails of Kotlin. So this guy created kind of like the first web framework in Kotlin, and he called it Kara, and it was basically the idea of bringing Ruby on Rails to Kotlin. But then Kara had its own model of working. It was MVC. It had like, it was rich in HTML and stuff like that. And so that kind of gave way to Wasabi and then gave way to Ktor. And now I saw recently a project which is implementing a Ruby on Rails framework using Ktor. So we've come full circle. Okay. Ktor can be used for many things. Create server-side applications, which is HTTP APIs. RESTful systems. Notice I don't say REST APIs because there's no such thing. Sockets, web sockets, or just plain sockets. Client-side connections. And its goals are to be simple, flexible, performant, and cross-platform. Now notice that everything I have said there is positive. I wouldn't ever create a slide that says it's meant to be complex, slow, and only works on the JVM, right? So I'm not saying that that may not be true. I'm just saying I haven't put it on the slide. A simple server to get started, because and if anybody has ever done anything with, if you haven't seen, just out of curiosity to kind of, you know, pat myself on the back a little bit, how many of you ever looked at Wasabi? Oh, come on, someone raise your hand, please. Serge, please, just right there. Thank you. So Wasabi was based on this idea of Express.js, which was in the Node world, if anyone's ever done that. Which is what kind of like a very simpler approach to writing HTTP endpoints. And this is basically the simplest application that you can get with Ktor. So you have here essentially the start. What I'm doing is I'm creating an embedded server, and we'll see that there's multiple deployment options. So I'm creating an embedded server. The engine that I'm using is Netty, and again we'll see that that's flexible. I'm setting the port, and then I'm starting the server. And I'm just saying that the server, you have to wait until it finishes. Okay? And then comes the routing part. And here I basically define the routing, right? So I say, in this case, I have a single route, which is get. And the get has, it's whatever goes to the URL of slash, basically the index. I'm going to respond with a text, content type text HTML, which is wrong. That's a bug. But I'm just making sure that you're attentive here. That should be text.plain, because that really isn't HTML. That works, but it should be text.plain. So the idea here is essentially that I'm trying to make it as simple as possible and define a single route, which is a response. Now, if you look at this in comparison, for those of you that have done Spring, with Spring, basically, you would have to create a controller class, you would have to create a function, and that function then would have a single entry point, and then the corresponding responses. Okay? Now, a Ktor application is actually composed of multiple modules. These slides were initially in a beautiful blue and yellow, and then people were complaining they couldn't see it properly, so I changed colors to dark, grim, kind of like your weather outside, of this. Okay, so here I have Ktor application. And a Ktor application can consist of various modules. And we'll see what a module is in a second. So a module essentially can be an entire kind of like application, so to speak. So if you think of, for example, a very large application where you have something to deal with invoicing, something to deal with customers, something to do with shipments, etc. In a Spring application, for instance, you could model these as controllers. You could actually model them as different microservices. In Ktor, you can actually define them also as modules. So they're kind of very independent, but the same application server will load up these modules and provide you with the responses, etc. When inside a module, I essentially have a request that goes through a pipeline. And the first thing normally that it does is go through this thing called the routing. And the routing then defines where to go to the application logic, and then I get the response out on the other end. Now, in between these things, we can have what's called a feature, right? And a feature is essentially a functionality that in Kotlin in Ktor is defined using a series of configurations along with a concept of an interceptor, which we'll see. So here what I have is essentially a feature, and I can add different functionality to my Ktor application with features. So these features can also be in any place. It's not just in a normal application, again, in a normal web framework, you might have, for instance, a feature, a phase, which is like, for example, pre-request, after request, pre-response, after response, where you can intercept the data coming in and out. This is essentially the same thing. The difference with Ktor is that it's not limited to 4 segments. It's not limited to 4 phases. You can actually have multiple phases. And then there's a series of phases that come out of the box, but you can in fact add more phases, and then you can have one feature depend on another feature of the phases that other feature defines. So examples of features could be, for instance, encoding, could be compression. So if I want compression functionality, I just enable the compression feature. And then that intercepts my responses, and it gives me back that information, compressed. Routing itself, in fact, is a feature. So while it's normally a feature that's always there, but it is, in fact, a feature. So routing itself is implemented as a feature too, which kind of makes it very flexible. Okay, so I'm going to now switch, and we're going to just see a whole bunch of code, and then we'll finish off with a few more slides. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them, not me. I'm joking. Any questions so far? No? Okay, fine. Be like that. I go to all this effort, I talk so much, and you're just remaining silent? Fine. Okay. I'm too old to take questions, you know that? Anyway, so how many of you have done Spring? Don't raise your hands. It's a joke. You already told me. I've got a mental map of everyone that did Spring. So let me show you something about Ktor. You know, if you go to start.spring.io, and what is it? Spring. What did I do? String? Spring. Sprint. Start.spring.io. You see this? Okay. So the first thing, sorry, I'm in the wrong. I'm doing Ktor, not Spring. I'm joking. So they've got that. We have this. Start.ktor.io. Okay. So essentially, it's not a copy paste. But it's the same idea that you can really get up and start it very quickly with Ktor. So you have a bunch of different functionality, authentication, templating features, and you can just basically click these, and then it will generate a zip file for you, and you can download that and open it in your favorite IDE, such as, I don't know, IntelliJ IDEA, for instance. And just the first thing that came to my head, IntelliJ IDEA. There's the other option also, which is basically using it inside the IDE. So I can say Ktor, and you can see here that I have basically the same functionality. I can select Gradle, Kotlin Gradle. How many of you use Kotlin Gradle DSL? You like it? Yes? Good. Have you told Gradle that? You should. Then you can use the different like Netty, Jetty, Tomcat, CIO. Anybody knows what CIO is? No? I'll keep it for later. That'll be like the highlight of the evening. What is CIO? I'll give you a clue. IO stands for input output. And then the Ktor version that you want to use. Okay, and then again here you can select like you want the server, or you want to create a client application, etc. And then this will get you through a series of visits. So for instance, if we say I want to create a simple application with static, so say for example routing, not web jars. Where's my static? Where's my static? Where's my static? Static content over here. I don't want cores. I want Gradle. I hit next. Com sample. Oh, you can also see that you can add a Swagger model. Anybody use this Swagger? Swagger is like this thing that you can generate endpoints, and then clients can consume it. And everything that you could potentially do wrong is Swagger. But that's just my opinion, you know. So whatever over here, and then we will hit finish, and this will basically create a project for me. How many of you use Gradle? Right? What I love, the best thing I love about IntelliJ IDEA is that most of the time, every time you use Gradle, it'll pop up this project, and every single time you just click use import, use wrapper, and hit OK. And it's just like, why are you even asking me? Why don't you just do this every single time? But anyway, that's a completely different topic. So we'll have this. It'll pull down the entire internet at this point. And then essentially what I have is my application, okay, with a whole bunch of stuff that you shouldn't be looking at. Okay, there you go. So that's my application, and then I can just say run and go away. Run. no, not debug. I just switched. Okay, this is a new laptop. I promise you, I wasn't using this touch bar crap before, and so it's yeah. Anyway, okay, run, go, run. Scanning files to index. That's the other issue that I didn't install. Do you know the neon cat progress bar? Have you seen that? So there's a neon cat that you can install, and every time IntelliJ is like doing the whole being slow, you'll see that neon cat, and then it'll just distract you, and you won't get pissed off at IntelliJ. So install that. So here I have like hello world. There you go, and it's fast. I mean, you can see how fast Ktor is, right? I mean, look at the instant response. Anyway, so here's that's basically the simplest thing. Okay, now let's break this down, and I'll show you how this actually works. And we're going to start with the simplest of the simplest things, which is what you saw. You see, this code I actually got right. I wrote content to explain. Now, the cool thing about this is that this is Kotlin, right? So you get all of that wonderful type information, and you get, statically type, all of that information. Is very, very nice. About the only feedback that I would say, and I've given, like, one of the issues that you might encounter when you're working with Ktor is that purposely, because of Java 9 modules and all of these wonderful things that people want, modularity, Ktor isn't one big giant library, right? It's a whole bunch of different jars, right? So if you want authentication, it's one jar. If you want HTML, it's another jar, etc., etc. So you have to just make sure that you're including the right things. And then you basically just define your routing, define your get, etc. Now, if we clicked into routing, we can see that basically this is just extension function over application that takes a routing configuration, and then what it is essentially doing is installing that routing in what would be the equivalent of kind of like a routing table. Okay, we'll see a little bit more in detail later on how we can define these different routes. Now, the next one is, for instance, static, right? So if I go to the static, here what I'm showing you is how I want to load static pages. So for instance, if I have my resources, which is JSON or CSS or what have you, I basically say anything that's under the folder static is going to be displayed as a static file, right? And then you can define the resources, and you can just load up files from the folder, etc. So here you can see that I have a static folder, I have a Kotlin logo, and then I can basically run this. And in order to run this, what we need to do is define the application point. So in this specific case, going back to my other example, whatever, here you see that I have this construct, and I ran this run main blah, blah, blah. It was different from the slide that I showed you. The slide here, you saw that the code was essentially, where is the code? Code. The code here is just the main function. It's the main entry point of your Kotlin application. It's in creating an embedded Netty server, and then it's defining the route and running. This is great for demoware, but you usually do not configure your entry point in your application like that. That's where it comes back to the concept of the modules that I was talking about. So the modules in Ktor, you can configure everything with code, or you can configure your application, and many of the parameters like the port, all of this information, you can configure it in a file, in a configuration file, which is using HOCON format. So here you can see that I have this configuration file where I'm saying it's a Ktor application, the deployment is port, port can also be set an environment variable, and then I'm saying load the following modules, and this would be a comma separated list of modules. In this case, I'm just going to point to the module that I want to load. So coming back to the static one, you can see that it's in a file called static, which you know that Kotlin will compile to static.kt, and the function, the module, is called static. So then basically here I would put static kt, and then here would be static, and then if I run my application, the actual application is this code over here. So this is the main entry point. right? So all the time and through all the demos, all you'll see me doing is just change the application config file to just point to a different module. Each time I'm only loading one module, but if I want, I could load 10 modules in the same application host, right? So we can run this, and you can see that it opens up again the URL over here, and then I can come here and I can say, for example, static Kotlin logo, and it will just display the static file for me. Okay, so pretty simple to basically do simple operations of whether it's just generating HTML, generating plain text, or just serving up static content. And the next one is actually HTML. So this is how you can return HTML in Ktor, right? I can actually create a string, which is HTML, and send it back as content type text.html, or I can actually use Kotlin X HTML. How many of you are familiar with Kotlin X HTML? So that's basically a library which allows you to write HTML using Kotlin. So statically typed. If you're familiar with HTML builders of Groovy, you can do that with Kotlin. So here you can see that I have body. Body is essentially part of the Kotlin X HTML library, and then I'm defining my header, I'm defining my entry points, and mixing that with Kotlin code, right? So again, if you're used to React, sometimes people see this and they're like, oh my God, what are you doing? Like, you are mixing HTML with Kotlin code. You're like, yes, what exactly are you doing with React.js again? Oh, yeah, okay, no, I never thought of that, did I? Difference is that React is JavaScript, so you don't know if it doesn't work until too late in life. So, did I just say that? I'm sorry. So I will say HTML, KT, and then here I would say HTML, and then I run this, and you can see that it loads it up. You see how fast it is? Page cannot, that's not an error. Page cannot be found, because if we go back to HTML, there is the HTML DSL root, right? So here I would have to put HTML DSL, and then this would give me back the HTML DSL, right? And if you want to look at the sources here, we can look at the sources, and you see that it's very clean, nice HTML, no fancy stuff, right? I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it in a good way, right? Like, I get so frustrated that, I mean, with all these wonderful new web frameworks, that you need to know CSS isn't valid anymore. You need to know some other language that translates into CSS. And you're like, I want to change one little bullet point on my website, and I have to download Webpack. For that, I have to install Brew. Brew has to install NPM, NPM Webpack. You give up. You're like, screw it. Let's just outsource this to a design company. I think there's like some conspiracy to give people work kind of thing. Okay, so now let's look at features a little bit. So routing, as I said to you in all the examples, what it was doing is essentially installing a root. But it doesn't just install a root. So routing, this is kind of an equivalent of writing install routing. The difference is that if the feature routing is installed, it will hook onto it. And remember that I said that the features have this aspect that you can configure things, and we'll see an example of that. But routing, what it's doing is installing that routing feature. But here what I'm also doing is installing other features. In particular, I'm installing compression, and I'm installing default headers. So if I were to run this one, which is features, KT, and then features, you can see that I now just get a bunch of custom headers. So loading this, you can see that the URL is, again, in this case, headers. So we've got the tools open, and if you type headers, you can see check the headers. I check the headers, and I can see that I'm getting a whole bunch of custom headers back, that default headers back, that I wouldn't usually get if I weren't installing that header feature. And if I'm sending back data that can be compressed, obviously it's going to send back that data that is compressed. Now, JSON. It also comes with support with JSON out of the box. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we support Jackson and JSON, right? Right? Right. Right. By the way, Sergey, if I say right, just always say right, even if it's wrong. So here what I'm doing is I'm installing content negotiation. And content negotiation, if you're not familiar with it, basically what it does is you send an accept header. It will tell you whether it can accept. You send a request header saying that I want to accept application JSON. The server will then see if it can serve up application JSON. If it cannot serve up, then it will return a media not supported status code. If it can, then it will serve it. All that content negotiation with the accept headers is done by just saying install content negotiation. Right? And it also takes into account the quality. So you know that, for example, in these content negotiation headers, you can send, for instance, application JSON 0,1 and then text plain 1.0, right? And the higher the number, the more priority is given to that content. So then the server would first try and send back text plain, and if it couldn't, it would fall back to application JSON. So here is an example of how I can actually configure a feature. It's not only about intercepting, but it's how I can configure. And what I'm doing is, in this specific feature, there is a language, there's a DSL that allows me to configure JSON. So I can say that inside JSON is a external library, I can say set pretty printing, serialize null, and all of the other options that you have available for JSON, you would be able to configure here in the routing, in the installation of the feature. Okay? Once I do that, then I can just call customer. In this case, I'm basically creating a class customer, and I say respond with model. And doing so will just respond back with the model in JSON format. And I really don't have to worry about anything else. So again, let's go back here, and we're going to go to the application config, and we'll say JSON KT, and then we'll say JSON and run this. And now I can say customers. What did I call it? Customer. There you go. You got to put like a thread sleep in that little URL, so that until it's loaded, it doesn't actually let me click on it. So there you go. So you just get back like JSON there without having to do much. Okay? Any questions so far? No? Okay. Right. Let's get to a little bit more complex in terms of verbs. Now remember, I said that Ktor is simple, so there's actually no complex example here. But here, for instance, I have routing with get and post, right? So in the get, I'm basically just responding with HTML, and I'm just basically sending back using the Kotlin X HTML to send back HTML. And in the form, I'm submitting that information, and what I'm doing is I'm reading that information. In this case, it's a multi-part form, so it has support for application form post. It has support for multi-part forms where you can upload files and fields, and then I can access the value, I can access the file name, I can access the content type, all of that easily. So post KT, and then here we'll do post, run it. Okay, so now in this case I need to do the root. There you go. And then I say, hello, my friend. Hello, it's me. It's been a long time. No, never mind. Choose file. Whatever. There you go. Oh, by the way, if anyone wants to sponsor Kotlin Conf, I can send you the brochure. Subliminal advertising there. Send, and then you see that I say, hello, my friend, it's me, it's been a long time, and the file name of the PDF application. And of course, obviously, you're going to be able to access the file as well, because otherwise it wouldn't be much of a upload, right? So that is also supported. Now, one of the things that you notice here is that every time I'm defining a root, I'm using this string, right? Now, this string is okay, but it takes away one of the benefits of using a language such as Kotlin, which is that type safety. So, you know, generally, if I'm using something like IntelliJ and I say, okay, if I have a method called form and I rename it, IntelliJ can also usually search for the string form and say, do you want to rename this instance as well? But what you can also do is use what's called locations. Now location, disclaimer, I don't really agree with the naming here. I don't think it's entirely clear. But the idea behind location is because there's a location header. How many of you know the HTTP header location? No? Okay. How many of you, well, did you confuse that with the HTTP header location? No? Okay. Then you just destroyed my whole theory. I think he said yes. So what this basically does is essentially say map this to index. Index is a class, right? So here I say, for example, employee/ID, map that to employee, and then value ID. So this is a parameter as part of the routing, and it's going to be parsed and displayed as the property ID of this class. Now, we are using this in lowercase because this is the class is the structure that is being used by location, but obviously it's not really a class. It's just having that effect so that I can access the actual properties. And what this allows me to do is now have essentially strong typing. So now I can define my roots. Instead of calling it /whatever or /form, I can put index, employee, and so on and so forth. Right? You following me? And the only thing with this is that it is experimental. So if you don't include the experimental, you're going to get a whole bunch of warnings that this is experimental. Why is it still experimental?
We don't have clear design yet.
Okay.
Including naming.
Including the naming, yeah. Okay. No, because I mean, the point is because there's a very, very useful header in HTTP which is called location. And if you're not familiar with location, one of the things that you can do with HTTP is that when you make a post, which is to create, for example, a new resource, that resource usually doesn't exist on the server. So let's say that you're doing post to create a customer, right? And then the customer goes to the database, generates an ID, and you get back that ID. How do you get back that ID? You can actually use an HTTP header, which is called location, which is exactly for what it is. Location is giving you back the name of the newly created resource. So, and that's when you're creating like RESTful systems, a lot of people use that because it's part of the language of the protocol of HTTP. So this immediately for me was like, this has nothing to do with location as such, right? You can call this, oh, I know, I got a new name. You can call it really strongly typed root. There you go. Brilliant. Okay. And that's why I'm not in marketing. Now, you might be asking, do we have support for authentication? Absolutely. I'm only going to show you one example here, which is basically basic authentication, but there is support for JWKT, there's support for forms authentication, and then any kind of custom authentication. Yes?
Kerberos? Do you support Kerberos?
I don't think so out of the box, no. No.
Okay.
But
we have LDAP.
LDAP, yes. Also, you arrived before the part I said, sorry, you arrived after the part that I said it's open source. So we accept pull requests as well. But essentially, whatever you use, it's going to work the same way, right? You have this idea of the principle, and then you have, in the case of basic authentication here, if you're familiar with it, you normally set the realm. And then I have a validate function that's passing in the credentials, some strong validation there, and then I can set the user ID principle. And that user ID principle is now propagated throughout the entire application that I can access on a per session basis. Then here in the routing, in this specific case, there is no authentication. So if I run this, it's not going to prompt me for any kind of authentication. In the case where I run, if I define it under authenticate, then anything defined under that function is going to require authentication. And notice that this auth is referring to the same name as the authentication that I have defined. So you can actually have different authentications with different names, and having different routes use these different mechanisms to authenticate the requests. I won't run this because it works, just like all of my other demos. Now, custom features. this is an example of a custom feature. So the idea behind the custom feature, as I said, is essentially twofold. A feature is a step where I configure a series of parameters that feature would use, and then the actual work that the feature is doing, which is essentially an interceptor. And the interceptor, what it does is intercept something in the whole pipeline. It can intercept a request, it can intercept a response, and then there are different phases. There's out-of-the-box phases like pre-request, post-request, pre-response, post-response, pre-routing, etc. And then there's the ones that are defined as, like any new feature can define a new phase, and then you can have a dependency of one feature to another saying that put this feature after this other phase that is defined by my other feature. At runtime, if that phase doesn't exist, obviously you would get the corresponding error. Usually the way that you define a feature is that you define a containing class which essentially has the configuration parameters for that feature, and then you have the companion object that implements the feature, right? This is where the magic, so to speak, happens. So here what I'm doing is I'm installing this feature. I have access to the pipeline call, which is the application call pipeline, and the actual configuration that is coming in. I apply the configuration, and then in here, I'm essentially implementing the feature. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying intercept this with the actual functionality that I want, which in this case, all I'm doing is adding a custom header name value. By the way, you don't have to implement this custom feature to have custom headers, right? You can always add headers just using default headers. I mean, at any point you can add a header. But this is now to add like custom headers if you want. So how do I use this feature? I just say install custom header and then define the values, which are the properties that we saw up here for the configuration class. And then every time I call any function, that custom header is going to be applied, right? And if you look at the source code for Ktor, essentially every single functionality that we've seen so far is following this exact pattern, right? It's all essentially features that are being shipped out of the box. Okay, so if we take a look at locations, and if we take a look at static, and if we take a look at post, you can see that all I've done all the time is just routing, get, blah, 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 right? Now, this doesn't really scale in a real-world application. Even if you were to divide this up into 100 modules, generally you wouldn't create a module per, like to map this to the concept of a Spring application or a Spring Boot application where you have a controller necessarily wouldn't be mapped to a module, right? A module could contain various controllers, right? So how exactly do you structure your application for this to be maintainable? That I don't have basically one long function where I'm defining everything. Well, the beauty of this is that this is all functions. So I can basically define these functions anywhere. And this is Kotlin, so I don't even need a class. I can just define a function in a file and then just reference that function. The simplest, and here's one thing that sometimes puts people off with Ktor, is that it's very flexible. There is no strict rule of how you have to define things. So it's not like, for instance, Spring or MVC models or Ruby on Rails that is like convention over configuration, which is you have to define a controller and the surname. The suffix has to be called controller in the case of .NET frameworks, and then you have to do this and that, right? Here, you essentially can define anything anywhere. One common way to do this is to essentially use this format, where basically, and this doesn't have to be in the same file. You can actually have these in different files, right? So I can have root home, for instance, and then everything that would be home be defined in this function root home. Now this is an extension function to home. And I say it's the simplest approach because since it's an extension function, you have access to the get, you have access to everything that you need very easily and be able to just define these things, right? It's going to be part of the routing. It's already going to define it as part of the routing. So this is one way that you can structure applications. I can have, for example, a file called home where I have a get and then I have an about. I can have another file called root employees where I have a get, a post, a delete, a put, etc. And then in my actual app structure, all I'm doing is in the routing table, I'm just saying home and employees. I'm basically calling the functions. Now, one question that may arise is, how do I pass in dependencies? Right? Well, how do you pass in dependencies in a function as parameters? Right? I mean, if you're doing functional programming, there is no such concept as IOC containers as such, because it's just a parameter to a function. So of course here I can pass in any parameters that I want. Of course, that doesn't mean that you have to follow this model. In fact, you can use your more traditional approach of using, for instance, an IOC container, whether it's Codeine, whatever it is, and you can define your classes and you can have the application inject all of the necessary things using your favorite IOC container. Right? But the point here is that it's quite flexible in what you can do in how you structure your application. And I'll show you a little bit more complex examples in a moment where you'll see that we're structuring things a little bit differently. But just to run this one, we'll call it application, actually, let me, application structure, no, it's called app structure, and then app structure, run this, run. So now you can see that I have in my app structure, I have my employee with a get, and I have my home with a slash and about, right? So you can see that it's already loaded the index page. If I put about, it would load the about page. If I put employee, it would load the employee page. Okay, it's there. You can't see it, but it's there. I could have just written anything there. You would have believed it. Can't believe that I actually made all of this thing work. Just use small fonts. Now, one question you might have is testing. How many of you do testing? Okay, never mind. You don't have a question about testing. So in the real world, no, in the fake world, in the conference world, and in the classes world, they tell you about this thing called testing. You don't really need to do it. It's just nonsense. We test in production. That wasn't, I don't mean we as in JetBrains. Don't say that like, oh, Hadi says that JetBrains tests in production. I'm joking. We actually have a lot of tests, lots and lots of tests. So anyway, so here we have application, an example where I'm saying application testing, and I can say testing equal true. And then if I go to the actual test, you can see that I can say with test application testing equals true, handle request, get, assert the values, etc. So what this means essentially is that, this is a very simple example, but Ktor is very testable. You don't need to crank up an entire real world server to test it, right? It's very fast, it's very testable. You get all of the features, all of the functionality there without actually having to create the overhead of the sockets and all of these things, right? That is abstracted away and it's quite testable. Okay, and if you've worked with something, for example, like some other frameworks, you know that sometimes you have to run this like the complete server to get something like that. Doesn't mean that you don't necessarily need to run your integration tests where you have a real server, right? But generally, if you want to test your handler logic, your get, post, delete, all of these routings and all of these other things of whether things are being compressed, etc., you can do that without having to fire up an entire instance. So now let me show you an example where we can use something a little bit more, somewhat different, which is chat, which is essentially using WebSockets, right? So here I'm using, because most of the stuff that I've shown you to date is essentially HTTP protocol. So here what I have is a chat application, right? So I create a chat server. Again, I'm installing some headers. I'm installing code locking. I'm installing WebSockets, session for cookies. And then here I'm defining my routes. So WebSocket, and then just basically what it's doing is just consuming all the sockets and repeating everything that's coming through, right? So if we were to run this, so I have my chat there, and then what I can do is, for example, fire up Safari, and I have my chat there, and then I can say hello, and then it's me. Anybody know who that is? Anyone? No? Adele. Hello, it's me. No. Okay. Not into music, no? No. Okay, never mind. Right, so that's, again, an example of that. It's not just about HTTP. I mean, there's other support, there's WebSockets, etc. Another example, there's an example called uCube. uCube, if you're not familiar with it, it's YouTube, but with Kotlin. What we usually do when we do things with Kotlin, we take anything that is a C and replace it with a K. In the case that we don't have a C, we just take some other random letter and replace it with a K. In this case, we took the T and we replaced that with a K. So we created uCube. Go away. So here, an example of how I can also structure my application. So I have my class database, I have my login. You can see that basically I've created what we were talking about before. I'm using locations. I have my login as an extension to root. I have this separated by different files, etc. And then basically I have the upload functionality, video, class, everything basically typical Kotlin code, and then my application code, essentially what it's doing again, installing the headers, installing some configuration, reading some configuration, and then defining the routing, and then I'll have my little uCube application that you can upload videos and do a bunch of different things. Notice here that I'm using the configuration environment. So if we take a look at the application conf here, you can see that I can define custom parameters that I can pass into my application as well, right? So here I've defined uCube, session, the cookie, the key, the upload folder, etc. So you can pass in environment variables, you can pass in just direct variables from your application config. We also have support for hot reload or auto reload. So essentially you can just change some things and it will reload. It currently doesn't work on Java 11, but on other versions it does. It does, right? Yeah, you're learning, man. It's always a yeah. We should. Everything works. Everything is wonderful. Everything is awesome. And then there's also a reverse proxy. And this is a good example of showing you how you can essentially move towards what I showed at the beginning, which was a microservices architecture, right? This is an example where I am using Ktor server to create a Ktor server application, and then I'm using the HTTP client, which is again Ktor, and then that HTTP client is going to make a call to an external web service. In this case, it's going to call Wikipedia, get the response, and send it back. Okay? Now, all of this is essentially built from the ground up in Kotlin using coroutines, right? So I forgot about that, didn't I? Yeah, minor little detail. Let me fix the slides. Yeah, so all of this is using coroutines. But notice that, like, it's magic. Like, no, it's not. Don't be fooled. Coroutines are not magic. But the point is here that I'm not doing anything special. I'm not doing any suspend functions or anything like that. Now, what happens? If I say, for example, you know, I'm going to create this static page or this simple text, and this simple text, this is going to call out to a database that's going to last for 12 hours, that's magically not going to be fixed with Ktor, right? That call is still going to wait 12 hours. What the coroutines is doing, and is transparent to you, is making sure that that's not blocking the request on Ktor, right? So that it's not blocking that thread, that other requests can come in. If you want to deal with asynchronous code, there you have to then use some solution, such as, for example, coroutines. So for example, here, what I am doing is I'm launching my Ktor application, but then I've got a very long running call. And what I'm doing here is I'm using a coroutine to launch that onto a different context and then do my work. Once it comes back with the work, respond back to the application, right? So if, for example, you're connecting to a database and you're using something like JDBC, that's not automatically going to solve any scalability issues that you may have in terms of performance, in that it's going to magically make it much faster, right? Your bottleneck is going to be that call to that JDBC called. So if you do, for example, like NIO, or there are some wrappers, I think that we're working on some wrappers. Leona is working on some stuff around asynchronous JDBC, etc. That would be a good option to use with this. Okay. So I think that's it in terms of examples. Now to just summarize. So deployment options. I've shown you most of the examples basically running Netty. We also support Jetty, Tomcat, Seti, Reti. No, I'm just joking. Netty and CIO. Now, who knows what CIO stands for? Oh, who? What? What does it stand for? Coroutines IO. Yeah. So essentially what that is the idea that, let me take a step back. Ktor is meant to be multi-platform, right? Right now, I said to you not everything on the slides are true, but they're very positive. So Ktor is meant to be multi-platform, and right now the server works on the JVM. The client works on the JVM native, so you can actually run an HTTP client with Kotlin native. It works on JavaScript. The idea here is that with the CIO is Chief Information Officer, is that we are going to essentially do the functionality that Netty provides, allowing us to provide Ktor on all platforms, whether it is native, whether it is JavaScript, whatever, right? But right now it's not production ready. Definitely don't use that in production. It's very experimental and it's marked as such. So if you want to deploy today your applications with Ktor, recommended is either use Netty, Jetty, Tomcat, or any of the flavors that you can. In terms of containers, we support Tomcat, Jetty, support for Java 6 through 11, with the caveat that the auto reload doesn't currently work for Java 11. In terms of where you can deploy, Google App Engine, Heroku, Docker containers, and everything that is going to come out tomorrow that will probably replace Docker, and we need to learn because, hey, that's how our industry is, right? But the important thing is that whatever it is, IntelliJ will support it. So if you want more information, go to ktor.io, also go to start.ktor.io, and believe it or not, we also, I mean, this might come as a real big shock to you, but we actually do have documentation. So we have servers. Ignore this little thing over here, but like if you go to deploy, if you go to lifecycle, it's showing you all the examples. We have samples that you can download with all of the kind of different information that you have. Then we have also the API.ktor.io, which gives you documentation about the API. Okay? And that is not auto-generated documentation, but I'll close that so you don't notice that it's not auto-generated. We also have Leona and Sergey that are really, really active on the Kotlin Slack. There's a Ktor channel, and they're very, very kind, and they always answer your questions. And if they didn't, though, they're going to have to now because I've put them on the spot. Okay? So, any questions?
Okay, first of all, thank you for the presentation, and my question is, it looks really fun and fancy and everything, but jokes aside, we have Spring Boot as a default framework for backend development now in our time. And what do you think? What is the place for Ktor in our time and in backend ecosystem? Because you know, Spring Boot has a really big community. A lot of companies like Pivotal, Netflix support and develop a lot of modules and integration with service discovery and other stuff. And why would I, as you said, I have to sell this framework to my CTO or someone? And why would I do that? I mean, why and when would you use this framework instead of Spring Boot, for example?
And that's a very, very good question. Any other questions? No, that is a very good question. So here's the thing. It's kind of, I say the same, I guess I'm not the person to tell you when you should use one or the other, because that's you need an objective opinion on that, right? What I can tell you is a couple of things. First of all, you're absolutely right that Spring has a very large community. It has a very large ecosystem. There are tons of more functionality and modules and things that you can include with Spring that you do not have here. Absolutely true, right? So if there are things that are lacking right now for you, this isn't the solution for you. Spring has somewhat of a different programming model. I mean, essentially, it's more or less the same, but there are certain restrictions and there are certain overheads, and Spring is very heavy, for example, on annotations, etc. We are not, right? In terms of performance and startup time, and Sergey, really, here, correct me if I'm wrong, even if I am wrong, but correct me later. Here, just give me, no, I'm joking. I'm always right. Sergey, Spring has a longer startup time. We've run performance, well, not we, Tech Power. I don't know if you know the site Tech Powers. Runs performance. On a few things, we outperform Spring. But those tests are somewhat subjective as well, and also conditioned to what exactly you're testing and how the sample application is put together, etc. So take it with a pinch of salt. But to summarize, I think, generally the people, and this is my approach, people that are using Ktor like it for its simplicity and its programming model, and don't necessarily want some of the overhead that Spring or Spring Boot is introducing. And this is the feedback that we usually get when people select it, right? A lot of people have come to Ktor because they find it way simpler for what they need, okay? But that comes with some trade-offs, as you say, right? We don't have, I mean, if you go to the Spring site in terms of, start.ktor.io and start.spring.io, right? Look at wherever the Seoul, like, we don't have all of this yet, right? So if you need all of that, well, I'm not going to say to you, use Ktor. If you need something that fits with the programming model that Ktor has, I mean, actually quite a bit of stuff there. And also you're looking at potentially maybe, because Ktor is not just about the server, it's also about the client side. So if you want to, for example, interop with multi-platform code, if you want to do code sharing, if you want to have clients and servers on different platforms and use the same programming model, these are some of the benefits that you get with Ktor. Okay?
Okay.
But I think that in addition to this, what I would recommend is, are you on Slack? Yeah. Are you on the Kotlin Slack? Yeah. Go to the Ktor channel, ask there. Say, those of you that have picked Ktor, why have you picked it over Kotlin, over Spring?
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, question.
Thank you very much for such a nice presentation. I'm a guy who just tried Ktor 2 weeks ago with some real small project, my home project, and it was really fun. I experienced so much fun with it. It's much better than Spring, I would say. And I also tried, it was like Kotlin, Ktor, Exposed, and Arrow project. So you probably know, you, for sure you know.
Yeah.
So this is a awesome thing, I would say, and I really appreciate what you are doing, guys. So continue with it. I hope you will just extend it with additional modules. One thing I noticed, just add some examples with for testing part, because there are only small part in documentation where you can find test and how to write test and how to use it with Ktor. And another thing, could you show how to write some validation part? With Spring it's pretty simple. You just add a validation annotation and it will be validated. For example, your incoming requests. So could you show it or just how
right now? No.
Oh, just say how to implement it. What is?
Oh, look, Leonard's raising his hands.
Okay.
I'll give you the license later. I'm joking. Yes, Leonard. Oh, do you need a mic? Yeah, can you
The validation part is depend on serialization library use. So if you use Kotlin X serialization, for example, you need just write init section in your class. Also, you could use any JSON or Jackson validation part.
Okay. And by the way, we support Kotlin serialization, right? Yes. Yeah. That was my question. Okay, awesome. Any other questions? Really? Nothing? Oh, look, there's a question there. Wait for the microphone because I think they're transmitting this.
I'm PHP backend developer. So if I need to use some features Ktor with run through cron, how can I?
If you need to use it with what?
So if I need some functionality of Ktor, and I use cron run.
Cron.
Yes, cron jobs. Schedule or choose cron.
Right.
How can I?
So you want to just run it as a cron job?
Yes, some cron job.
I mean, if I understood you correctly, you could basically use one of the embedded options and then just run it. It's basically a jar application that you can run. So you can just run it from cron. Or am I not understanding your question?
Yes, I can like jar application. So in PHP, in framework library, I can run some jobs through framework.
Are you talking like about in the framework itself, you want to have like a cron job that you can run while the application is running?
Yes.
Yeah, because you have that functionality in Spring, right? You can say, for example, you can decorate a class with a timer and say that this is running every 6 hours, right?
Yes.
That's what you're talking about. Do we have anything out of the box for that yet or not? No? Are there, Lona, he's excited. He's like, I'm working on this tonight. No, what? No, go ahead. Give me the, yeah. Because I actually asked for that like 7 years ago. No, not 7 years ago.
You can't do it directly with Ktor, but you could use coroutines. You could just launch a coroutine and wait timeout in for loop and write.
Yeah, but he wants it on a timed, not like he wants to run it every 6 hours.
Okay, and he could wait 6 hours, and in coroutine it's okay.
Okay.
Because actually a delay function in coroutines will not block your thread for 6 hours, so it's just okay to run a loop.
That's actually a good point. So you just basically
delay.
you just create a coroutine, delay it for 6 hours, and then run it, right?
Yeah, it's just okay.
Freak, that is brilliant. Brilliant. Don't you just love coroutines? Okay, any other questions? No? Okay, is there... Oh.
Yeah. So maybe another question. The latest release coroutines, they have this feature called scopes. What I'm asking is basically how scopes interact with the requests and all the stuff. Like if I want to like create different another coroutines from request, like send like 3 async stuff and then wait for them all, and then one of them fails, one of async fails. Like what would I get? The whole response will like fail with exception, or which one, or what would happen in this case?
If you launch all your coroutines in a request scope, then most likely coroutine failure will cancel the whole request. So you probably, most likely, you should see internal server error, unless you have a status page feature installed that could replace any error message with your page. So every request is a separate scope, and the application is the scope as well. So.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, another question.
Oh.
Do we have any resilience functionality in Ktor? So what I mean, do we have any built-in rate limiter or retrier for clients?
I don't think we have that. Do we? We do? It's not on the list here, man.
Yep, you have repeating and other. You could find it in the configuration.
What is it called?
Just a config flag.
Oh, okay. Learn something new every minute.
Are you going to support integrations with Spring Security, for example? As you can see, you have a kind of homemade authentication providing, but what about integrations with some, I don't know, Spring modules?
I should just give my microphone to others and go out and have a beer.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't think that we are going to integrate with Spring Security because it's too magic and it's not transparent and it's quite tricky to set up. This is why we probably need to design some better approach. We just don't support so many modules as Spring, but we are growing every day. So I see no reason to integrate with Spring because it will cause because we will need to pull the whole Spring. This is definitely not what we want to have. Perhaps if you need some particular authentication provider, you better to ask to create a ticket. We'll discuss it.
But like, is your question, is it more like I need a specific thing that you don't have, or is it more that I'm concerned that you are reinventing the wheel and why don't you just use some of the existing stuff that's been around in Spring for so long?
I think the both.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, maybe are you going to provide some kind of Spring data, but your implementation of that, so when we don't need again write the same SQL, something like that. So, or we will use expose, yes.
Yeah.
So what is the target on this way?
Well, I mean, Sergey, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that we're going to mix things like data layers and things inside this. That would probably still stay a separate library, like using exposed or whatever other ORM or whatever other platform you want there. There might be connectors that would be just features that would connect to that.
Okay.
Right? Or not. Yeah. There was a hand there.
This is like a follow-up question for the previous one. So, in my experience, Spring GPA and Spring Data are good only for prototyping. In real production code, you end up writing SQL anyway because of performance. So this is not a concern for me, but what is Spring DI. And what you're proposing to use to achieve dependency injection if you use Ktor?
You can use any framework you want with Ktor. I mean, you can use
just not Spring.
I mean, you can bring in Spring DI. The Spring DI is compatible with everything, no or not? I mean, you can. I don't know why you would want to, but you can. But you know, you can use Kotlin. You can use what is the other one on
Juice.
Juice. Anything like there is no limitation there, and if you want to, usually as part of the module setup, you can set all of that up. If it's not potentially possible, if you want to be able to set up something on a per request basis or whatever, you can install a custom feature. And I think on the website we even have an example of using custom features to be able to intercept your request with your DI.
Yeah, it's just that I found that fully configurable systems are not viable. So like things like Linux from scratch, they don't live. And what actually takes code are opinionated frameworks. So I suggest you just look into that and choose your like favorite. Our favorite DI for Ktor is this one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that, yeah, that is one thing that I was talking about in terms of flexibility, right? When you take a framework like Spring or MVC or Ruby on Rails or ASP.NET MVC or all of these, there is the concept of configuration, convention over configuration, right? Which is we're going to use this convention, this framework, this library, etc., etc. This is how you set up your DI. This is how you set up your dependencies. If you want to change it, you can, but this is the default, yeah, right? Here, we don't have that concept as such because one of the ideas was to be flexible. But I can see your point because at the end of the day, one of the things that people might feel a little bit pushed back about is when there is so much flexibility, there isn't one path, and that might cause confusion to people, right? That's essentially what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, we provide support for JSON and Juice and Kotlin serialization, Jackson and JSON and Kotlin serialization. I mean, is there anything out of the box for a specific? We don't have any favorite as such, like, or thing for DI, do we?
You only would have an example.
Yeah, just an example. I guess, I mean, maybe we could, I mean, but is there, yeah, like, maybe you could just set up, create a custom, we could create like a feature that then has the hooks for the DI, and then you could just install that feature and then just bring in your favorite DI. Because like, and I'm speaking of this a little bit from experience, because for instance, in .NET, anyone from .NET here? No? Okay, so now I can talk complete bullshit and you won't even know if I'm telling the truth. But in .NET, it's actually a true story. ASP.NET MVC, which is kind of like the similar of Ruby on Rails and Spring Boot, etc., which was done by Microsoft, they picked a specific pattern for dependency injection, right? And there was a long debate because they were picking service locator over class injection, right? So, and there was a lot of pushback around this. And people just wanted to have the corresponding hooks so that they can select whatever IOC framework they want. So I think that the way forward, and seeing how we're doing Ktor, but you know, the guys are better to decide on this, is just providing maybe a custom header, sorry, a feature for IOC, and then the corresponding hooks where you can basically say you can plug in this or the other. Okay? Yes, another question. You know, at first nobody had questions.
So, well, actually, I suggest maybe we'll just move.
Or leave? You want to leave?
No,
okay,
no,
bye.
No.
Thank you.
I think we should just grab some coffee, tea, and continue the question in like another way.
Is it quick? Is it easy?
It's related to asynchronous.
Let's grab coffee. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And by the way, folks, we have an idea to, after the tea and coffee and so on so far, we can go to the bar, actually, which is Puberty. The more information is on our Telegram channel.